Hi, welcome to episode 6 of the book of Genesis in our Radical Bible program here. And today we move into the fourth day of creation, which is to say the second round of the two pairs of 3-day creation stories that we see in Genesis 1. So let's look at the table that we've been looking at so we can see how this is parallel. So on the fourth day in verses 14 and 19 here, we see it's corresponding to day 1. On day 1, light was made. We don't know exactly what kind of light. It wasn't the sun or the moon or the stars because they're made on this fourth day. And our focus is really going to be on the sun and the moon, as the text does. And there's some curious ironies that we're going to find there when we look up close, both in relation to Israel's historical practice and in relation to the exiles in Babylon and the Enuma Elish and the religion of the Babylonians. So let's begin to look at the text itself and see what we can find there. And so as we begin, we have the same refrain, and God said, "Let there be lights." And we need again to look at each detail here. The "let there be" is calling for the creation of the lights, in contrast with the calling forth from the waters and from the sky and the production of vegetable and animals, which is to say that we saw last time in day 3 that mostly what was happening was the unveiling of what was already there, the dry land from under the water and the vegetation from within the earth. But now new things are being made. And we'll see the way this section of the poem is divided. Verses 14 and 15 say that God's intention is so, and the narrator adds, "and it was so." But it isn't so yet, because it isn't so until after God does what God says needs to happen here in verses 16 and 17. So just to note that again, God said, "Let there be," and "let them be for," and it was so, and then we see, "and God made, and God set them." And notice this is God's direct making here again. It says specifically that God made them and God set them. So the sky isn't doing the same kind of work that the earth was doing in terms of bringing forth vegetation. Whether that reflects something about the Israelites' understanding about the sky as different than the earth is an interesting question. But of course it would fit our understanding too of the earth as a living being and the sky not as a living being, because the sky is much more just a space in which things exist as opposed to the earth as fertile ground upon which things grow and move, etc. So we don't know that for sure, but that certainly is implied, one of the implications possible from this text. So let there be lights, plural here, and the word for light is not the word for light itself, or, as we saw in verse 4, here it's marot for lamps. Lamps is only used in this scene. The kind of lamp we're talking about is an oil lamp, as you'd see from Exodus 25, oil for the lamps. So, and we see that throughout in various places in Exodus. We see that olives are to be beaten to light the lamps. So we're picturing as if there were set oil lamps in the sky, although Ezekiel, which is also an exilic text, uses the word marot to refer to the stars, as we see all the shining lights of the heavens. So it could well be that the Exodus text written earlier than Genesis used the term differently, and that was only used for those kinds of lamps, actual physical lamps, rather than as a metaphor for lights in the sky. And maybe that was only an exilic issue. But here they are, lights, and then where they are is tricky, in the dome of the sky. But what we saw earlier was the dome, rakia, is to separate the waters. So it's in the sky, but it's separating the waters above the dome from the waters below the dome. And of course the waters above the dome are also in the sky. The sky exists beyond the dome. The dome is just a means to separate the waters from the above from the waters below. So it's a little tricky to picture. These are not exactly meant to be understood, we don't think, as the kind of night lights that you might paint on a little kid's ceiling to keep them safe at night, or something actually embedded in the ceiling, like many of us have lights in the dome of our room, so to speak. But somehow in that space up there, and certainly not as fixed things, because they obviously knew that the sun and the moon moved daily and monthly, as we know too. So whatever they meant by that, there it is. And again, to separate. And here we have to wonder, but wait a minute, in verse 4, didn't God make the light good to separate the light from the darkness? and called the light day, and the darkness called night, and that was the point there. So now when we get to this next section on day 4, what's going on? That these lights separate the day from the night. So we get some function or some understanding of that function from other writers. For example, the late Italian Jewish commentator Umberto Cassuto notes that the function of the moon and the sun is not to cause the day and the night, which exist prior to and apart from, as we saw in verse 4, but to separate them. But it did say to separate in verse 4 too, so it's not exactly clear that we'd get to that conclusion if it wasn't for the fact that they're trying to explain something that seems like it's already been explained. But there it is, these lights, not named yet. Notice they're not named as sun and moon here. They're just simply named as lamps to separate the day and the night. And that's the first thing they're for, to separate the day and the night. And then we're told something different, and it's the first time we're told anything like this in Genesis. Let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And there's some translation issues we can look at in a second here. But something just to note about that is this is apart from the function that they have in creation. So certainly to separate the light from the darkness, the day from the night, and as we see in verse 15, to give light upon the earth is part of their function in creation, just like the seeds produce more plants and the fruit produces food, etc., to allow creation to go on. This is more of a ritual function, and so we have to look more closely at the Hebrew here and perhaps even at the Greek and the Septuagint to make some sense of this. So first question is signs one thing and seasons another, or are these what scholars would call hendiadys, one thing expressed through a phrase with an and in the middle, signs and seasons, days and years, as a way of expressing time. Well, perhaps we're going to see the same kind of thing in the garden story about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Is it good and evil as two separate things, or is the knowledge of good and evil hendiadys, expressing like all knowledge, or perhaps simply all moral knowledge? We'll get there eventually. But the question of whether it's hendiadys is important here, because this is talking about one thing, or signs as one thing and seasons as another. So when we look separately, the Hebrew word for sign ot, or ototh, in plural here, the Greek semeia, is used a few times in Genesis, and note what it's used for. So in 4:15, it's the sign on Cain, to put a mark on Cain to distinguish him and protect him. In chapter 9, it's at the end of the flood story, and it's the sign of the covenant, whether that's the rainbow or a constellation that's a bow. We'll get there eventually in chapter 9. And then in chapter 17, it's circumcision as a sign of the covenant. So in all three of those situations, whether it's on Cain or from the flood story or from circumcision, the sign is an expression, something like what we might call a symbol, something that expresses a reference to something that's not present but is somehow part of that. Whether that's protection from God or God's reminder to God's own self to not flood the earth again, or Abraham at that point's mark of circumcision to mark his relationship with God via the covenant. Of course, in the chronology of Genesis, none of those things have happened yet, if we take these in a literal sense, but we'll keep that in mind that the original audience certainly knew some of that as they read this all the way through. So that's what's involved in signs. Let the lights in the sky be for signs, and we'll come back to that, what that might mean in a second. And then for seasons, the Hebrew here, ulem of adiem amod, or in the Septuagint, kairos, which is a very different word than semeia. Kairos, it corresponds to chronos, two different words for time. Kairos has to do with like the right time or the quality of time. So usually not season in the sense of a regularly scheduled unit of the year, like spring, fall, winter, and summer, as we'll see named when we get to the end of the flood story. But the generic sense of seasons as special occasions, perhaps. And that makes sense because we would see that in other places, we know the moon is to mark the seasons. The sun knows for its time of setting here from Psalm 104. But we also know that from the Midrash, as we see here from Genesis Rabbah, we see the quote, their interpretation of seasons, in order to sanctify new moons and years thereby. And my own note that follows that notes the irony here that I want to draw attention to. To the extent that this unnamed light, which of course will be the moon, although throughout here moon and sun are not named explicitly. The moon will be a sign or a mark of a season only when it's not visible. Because for the Israelites, it's precisely new moons that are the issue here, as we can see in a number of things. That we're offering burnt offerings here in Chronicles, Sabbaths and new moons. Also in an older text like Isaiah 1:14, your new moons and your appointed festivals, my soul hates, Yahweh says. Similarly in Ezekiel, new moons and Sabbaths. So the great irony is that these lights that are being created will mark the season, at least the moon will, by being invisible. And perhaps that's a little bit of a joke and a satire on the Enuma Elish and the Babylonian worship of the moon god Sin. Note, it's just a linguistic coincidence that the Akkadian word that could be spelled in English, like the English word sin, indicating acting against God, is a pure coincidence. The Akkadian word Sin is simply the name for the moon goddess. And we'll see later, for example, in the Jacob and Laban story, that the celebration there is of the full moon. The name Laban means white and would have been an epithet for the full moon that would have been celebrated there at the end of the cycle. So the Israelites celebrating the opposite of the full moon, the new moon, or one might call it the non-moon there, and days and years paralleling this as well. First mention of years of 161 times in Genesis, and that will be an issue when we look at the ages of people in chapter 5 and in chapter 9, and one of the great questions for people who want to take Genesis literally is how do we explain these lifespans that are hundreds of years long? But hang in there, we'll get there. So this is the intention. Three aspects of the purpose of these lights. To separate the day from the night, to let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years, and to let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth. Curiously, it's only the final one that seems to be the obvious function, that the moon lights the night and the sun lights the day. Again, we could hear this, another echo in a Doors song on The Doors' Break On Through, about the moon and the sun lighting the day and the night. Don't know how much Jim Morrison knew Genesis, but the echoes are there. So maybe one of you can follow that up and put something in the comments if you figured that out. So let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth. And here the word to give light is also more literally to shine, and it's also used here in the repeated verse in verse 17, but not anywhere else in Genesis. In these other places it also clearly means to shine. Here, for example, fire to give light by night, or to shine at night, or in Nehemiah here, the pillar of fire by night, so that it's so that people can see at nighttime. So, having announced this threefold intention for what these lights are for, then we hear the two-part response of God to God's own command. So we see here, as Westermann says, the work of creation described after the fashion of the making of handicrafts. It should not be forgotten, the products of the hands were regarded as works of art in the ancient world. So we'll see that again in Genesis 2:7, where it suggests that God is an artisan making humanity. We'd also hear that echoed in texts like Isaiah, where Isaiah cries out to put humans in their place. Shall the pot say to the potter, I don't need you? So humans, of course, being the pot and God the potter. So that very positive image of God creating through God's own handiwork, so to speak. So God made here, the same verb for verse 7, the two great lights. And notice that, as many commentators have known, there's a conflict in logic in the verse here. There are two great lights, and yet one is greater and one is lesser. And that pairing of greater and lesser we'll see in Genesis a couple of times, as we'll see. Gadol and Megan here, with Leah and Rachel, and with Judah and Benjamin, a different form. Rashi's comment, again the medieval Jewish commentator, notes here about the verse that the two lights were created equal, but the moon was diminished because she complained it is impossible for two kings to wear one crown. Notice how that seems parallel to blaming the moon for not being fully obedient to blaming the earth for bringing forth trees that have fruit on them rather than trees that you can eat as if they are fruit. In other words, from the very beginning, the medieval commentators, and as well as the older commentary in Genesis Rabbah, is showing that there's some kind of tension between God and God's creation, between obedience and not. And of course, that'll be the key theme in the Garden of Eden story, and that will be the key theme in chapter 6 as the cause of the flood. It will say that all creation has corrupted the earth, and that God regretted that God made humankind. So we'll see that implicit in the text, often not visible in English, is a little bit of resistance, perhaps, from creation to God's commands. Whether that's expressing independence or free will, we'll have to explore as we go on. So God made the two lights, the greater to rule, and the word for rule here, Mesheleth, is the female form of mashal, which we'll see later as something that's for humans to rule. It's not in this exact form. But again, as Westermann says, the personification of the heavenly bodies is a pre-Israelite motif so persistent that it recurs later in Judaism when there's no longer any danger of its being understood mythologically, which is to say the role of an inanimate object as ruling suggests that there's some power in it, like it's some kind of divinity or at least delegated agent of the divine. It's there, but perhaps the larger theology says otherwise, that ruling over is metaphorical here, as simply that the light is shining from above onto the earth. But we'll see more about that when we finish this on day 6, about the role of humans in ruling, and the lesser one to rule the night here. And then suddenly, just at the end, and the stars. Whether it's the lesser light to rule the night and the stars, or that God made the two great lights and the stars, these dashes that provide some punctuation in English are not there in the Hebrew, as you can see down here, where just and the stars are implied. The interlinear supplies what the text refuses to supply, which is the verb he made, because it's literally just and the stars. So it's not 100% clear whether the stars are simply an afterthought as part of God's creation, two great lights and all the other little lights, or whether the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, that the lesser light is ruling the stars, the moon is ruling the stars, which of course makes sense out of the idea that when the moon is full, the stars are less visible. But again, it's ambiguous in the Hebrew there. And so then, after having made them, God set them in the dome. It's almost as if they were made and just sitting on the craftsperson's shelf there until they were decided to be put up. It's interesting, I think, that the text divides it in two different acts using two different verbs and two different verses. God made them and God set them. So it's showing a couple of things here when we look at the whole thing together. It's showing that God makes these commands, and actually they're not commands, they're self-promises, because they're not commands to anybody but God's own self, or anything than God's own self. But it's to highlight that what God says will happen. That if God promises to make something happen or expresses the divine will, that's trustworthy. And that's an important thing to set up right in the very beginning, because many other cultures of the time, not necessarily the Babylonians, but also the Egyptians and others, their gods were not necessarily so predictable and trustworthy. They needed to be placated, they could help, but they could also be arbitrary and angry and jealous and do all kinds of things that did not follow a consistent pattern. And part of what's being established in Genesis 1 here is that the God of the Israelites, the God who's the creator, can be trusted, that creation is trustworthy, and the God of creation is trustworthy, and what God says will happen. So set them in the dome to rule over, just as the intention was, and to separate. Note that in the end here, it says to rule over and to separate, but not to shine light on the earth, except for right here. I guess it is right there. They're all three. They're in reverse order. So to give light upon the earth is the first one, to rule over is the second, to separate is the third, in the reverse order of the three up here. That's a little form of a chiasm, perhaps, and we'll look much more at chiasms later. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. So our fourth day session was a little bit longer because there's a lot going on there. But as we notice that each day makes it a little more complex. Now the sky is filled with moon and sun and stars. And what about the land? So when we get to day 5 in our 7th episode, we'll see how God will populate the land with creatures. See you then.